Welcome, everybody. I can't say that I ever imagined we'll meet under these circumstances. I don't think anybody did. And I just want to share that this morning, as I was getting ready, I'm talking to you from the Matan premises, where I hope to see those of you who come in person soon enough. And when I was getting ready to come here this morning, I found myself, for the first time since this terrible war started, paralyzed. I found myself scared. I've left the house many times. I've been helping with projects. I went to a funeral. It wasn't fear of leaving the home. It was fear of standing here before you, or sitting before you right now, and trying to talk about Torah as if nothing changed. And knowing deep down that nothing changed. We are still committed to our covenant with God. We're still committed to our people. We're still committed to our path. And therefore, we will keep going, learning Torah, just like in our shul. We kept dancing on Simchat Torah because we were in a safe, in a shelter anyway. And we will keep doing britot and bar mitzvot and weddings. And we will do all those things because the fact that our enemies hate us and want to destroy us doesn't change our commitment to what matters to us. And I knew all of that coming into this lesson. I knew that. And yet the thought that I'll sit here before you and have to talk about water and Tanakh, which is our topic for today and for the next few weeks, I'll explain in a minute, felt ludicrous. And I just want to, I hope you don't mind that I'm taking this time to share something personal. What got me going? What got me to just kind of snap out of it and walk out and walk in the wide open space on the way here, even though there's no shelter there, and even though it's close to our Arab neighbors, and I've been nervous about that in a way that I've never been before. And I'm angry about having my sense of confidence in my own country stolen from me. The thing that helped me snap out of it was knowing that I'll see you, that I'll see you at the end of this road, and that we will be together in it, and that we will uphold each other. So I want to ask for just 1 second, if you can show me your faces, those of you who can. Even if later you want to close your screen, it's fine. I understand. I know how it is. But I just want to see your faces and be here with you for a moment. Thank you. Thank you. Because this is what's going to get us through every day and all the challenges ahead, that we're together, that we see each other, that we're doing our best to be in it together. Thank you. And now, without further ado, I'm going to do what is difficult for me to do, but I know is the right thing to do, and recommit to our path, Torah and learning, and tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing together in this course and in today's class. And we have this class is dedicated to the memory of Sarah Freida, Bat Rav Shlomo and Rezel, Sarah Rudolph Olshin, Elea Shalom. And in addition, I want to just dedicate not the class itself, but our being here, our effort to be here and be present and be in it together, and what we have to invest in order to be here together, and what we have to endure and what we have to overcome. I want to invest this fortitude that we're showing here together to the memory of our fallen, to the health of our wounded, to the safe return of our Shuim and Nederim, and to the safety and success of our army in the days to come. And now I really will do what I promise I will. The idea of this course came to me when I was in a siyur in Nachalat Binyamin. And when you go around and you see the places that star in the biblical stories I love, it's different. It's suddenly you see the contours of the land, you see the contours of the topography, you see how topography in many ways defines historical moments, no less than people's decisions. Because if there's a narrow passage, there's a narrow passage, and that's where people are going to go to get to the battle. If there's a body of water in the way, that's going to be an obstacle for always. If there's a place with no water in it, it's going to be a desert, and that's going to define certain patterns of behavior. And you see how those things matter for stories that echo one another over and over and over again in history. I'll share one example. I don't want to get into it too much because we will bring a lot of examples during our learning together this year. But I'll bring one example, which is that if you go on the beach in Israel up north, if you're marching, let's say you're an army, just for the sake of an example, if you're marching up north on the road of the sea, as it was called, Derech Hayam, and you want to get into the Jezreel Valley, which is a very fertile, rich plot of land, but there's a mountain range separating the beach, the board plain, the beach. Let's go with that. The beach from the Jezreel Valley. There's only 3 places where you can pass, and those 3 narrow places where you can pass have been the site of battles from time immemorial, because every invading army that tried to go from Egypt and invade into the fertile parts of Israel, and then from there to go and fight the northern empires, be they Bavel, be they Nineveh, be they Ashur, whichever one was the one occupying Mesopotamia at the time, this was the only passages. So this was where people would wait for you for battles.
I think of Napoleon every time I drive by there.
Exactly. Napoleon, the king of Egypt. People just always had to go through there. Now, that in and of itself, so what? Who cares, right? Why should we care about this? But I'll give you one, I promised one example. I'm sorry. I'll give one last example, okay? When we came to Israel with Joshua, when we crossed the Jordan River with Joshua as a people, we were successful at conquering the mountain range at the heart of Israel, what is called Yehuda V'Shomron right now. We were successful at conquering those lands because or I'll put it this way, while we were not as successful at conquering the flatlands, be it the Jordan Valley, the Jezreel Valley, the plains by the ocean, and to a lesser extent in the Negev, because our enemies had chariots. They had heavy, what was the ancient world's heavy artillery. So they were able to use it to great effect against us in the flatlands to a great extent because we didn't fight together. We fought tribe by tribe in the book of Judges and failed because of that. Something to remember right now as we go into this war. But they weren't able to use those technological advantages against us in the mountain range. Chariots can't go up the mountain. So we were very successful at conquering those places. Fast forward to the War of Independence. In the War of Independence, we were successful at conquering the flatlands and some of the mountain range, but our enemies held on to the mountain range. And then when we became the ones with tanks, we became the ones with higher power, we were able to use the advantage very well in the valleys and in the flatlands, but we had to adopt a very different style of fighting to conquer the mountain range in the Six-Day War. So topography is history. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And then you start noticing how it's not just topography, but certain elements of the natural environment around us, be they stones or water or fire or trees or forests or deserts, and we'll touch upon many of those this year. Not only do they affect particular biblical stories, be they stories of battle or settlement or whatever it is, but they also start, if you start following them from one story to another, you start seeing that they're run like a thread through them, that there's a certain hidden story, a symbolic story, a deeper story that's imbued into those natural elements. And if you follow it, if you don't just focus on one biblical story, but rather follow a river as it runs through many, many, many stories, or follow rain as it falls through many stories, you start seeing that they start collecting themes and ideas in one story and then bringing them into the next and shedding light on deeper layers of the story. And this is what we're going to do in this course. We're going to start, our first month will be dedicated to water, drinking water. And we'll talk about rains and we'll talk about rivers. And we will see that the stories of rain and rivers and Tanakh are not all separate stories. They're all part of the same big theological grappling with what it is to be a human in the world. Next month, for Kislev, we'll talk about fire and light for obvious reasons, right? Tevet, we will talk about stones, and I'll explain why when we get there. Shvat, I think you can guess, right, what we're going to talk about in Shvat. We're going to talk about trees and plants, and so on and forth. And now that I tax your patience with this very long introduction, let us delve right in and start tracking what we are tracking today, which is rain in Tanakh, specifically rain. And I want to start in the first place where it's mentioned, a place that is familiar from us, from what we've just read in Parashat HaShavua this last week, this last Shabbat. And the first place where it's mentioned is a second story of creation. Just a reminder, in Perek Aleph of Bereshit, we hear about the triumphant, masterly creation of the world, where God just says, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be plants, and there are plants. Let there be me'orot b'shamayim, bodies of celestial light, something like that, and there exist. And he just completes everything, and then he stops for a day, and he says everything is great, and the world is perfect. And then in Pasuk Dalet of Perek Bet, we start again. We start with, sorry, I'm getting technical messages. I'll turn off my phone. We, on Perek Pasuk Dalet of Perek Bet, we suddenly start again with a second creation story. And it starts like this. I'm going to read the Hebrew. You have the English right there. If need be, I'll translate. Ele toldot hashamayim ve'haaretz behibar'am beyom asot Hashem Elokim eretz v'shamayim. Such is the story of the heaven and the earth when they were created, when God Hashem made earth and heaven. I want to pause for a second and point out that this is a very convoluted sentence. In many places in Tanakh, we see that the form, the way things are told to us, hints to the content, teaches us something about the content. So already the form here is giving us the sense that we're going to see a much more complicated story, a much less straightforward and, as I call it, masterly story than the one we saw in Perek Av. Because Toldot, here it's translated as story, but the truth is that it's not so obvious that this is what it means. Toldot can also mean the generation that come after you. Later in Parashat Bereshit, we read about Toldot Terach and Toldot Noach, right? And it's their children. It's not their story. So we're starting and like, are we talking about the children? Are we talking about the telling, the story? Also, who is the protagonist of this story that we're about to read? According to this, the protagonist should be the heaven and the earth. Suddenly God, who was very much the protagonist of chapter Aleph, right? God was like the one who said, let there be light, let there be this, did that. Suddenly God is relegated to a clause. Beyom asot Hashem Elokim. Like it's just like God is suddenly not the center of attention. But what is the center of attention? Is it the heaven and the earth? Is it their children? Is it their story? What are we even looking at? What's happening? And out of this somewhat murky and unclear beginning, we delve into this actual creation of the world. And we discover that this creation story is different than what we've seen before. Not only is it different, but the way it starts is by telling us not about what is, what God makes, but rather about what isn't. And it says the following in Pasuk Hey, V'chol siach hasadeh terem yeh ba'aretz, v'kol esev hasadeh terem yitzmach, ki lo hemtir asher melokim al haaretz v'adam ein la'avod et ha'adama. And when no shrub of the field was yet sprouted, and no grass of the field yet grew, because God did not yet send rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the soil. No, and it's kind of, this part is very beautiful linguistically, the Adam Ein La'avod et Adama, because here we already see the connection between Adam and Adama, right? Like there, Adama needs Adam in order to grow something out of. Now we already know from the first story that that's why he's named Adam in the first place, but here it's as if we revert back to a world that didn't have man, didn't have rain, didn't have plants, but clearly was somewhat formed, was somewhat there. Once again, relegating God to the side to some extent, because we're no longer talking about the ex nihilo, out of nothing, of the first creation story. Instead, we're dwelling in a place that God already did some things for, but not enough. And I want to ask you for a second, and it's going to be hard to have conversation, as usually my classes, anybody who's been before knows that we have a lot of discussion. It's going to be hard to do it in Zoom, but let's try, just keep ourselves to short sentences, please. When you hear the word terem, what does it evoke for you? What does the word terem means, not yet, to you? Feel free to just unmute yourself and say it out loud, because I can't see all of you at once.
Not yet. It's an excuse or delay.
Delay, excuse. Thank you, Batya. And I like the point of the excuse, because it's true. A lot of times when we talk, with each other, we say, "Oh, I didn't do it yet." So it's almost as if God is kind of like, "Oh, I didn't get around to it," which is an odd thing to say about that. Just I'm pausing for a second to say I see a question in the chat. People are asking about the source sheet and how to print it. I'm turning this question to Yardena, who's from the Matan team, who's faithfully following us here. Yardena, can you hear me? It should have been in the email you received with a link for this class. If you didn't get a link, I suggest you write directly now an email to the Matan team and ask them to send it to you, because I don't have the ability to send it to you right now. I'm sorry. I just don't have the technical means to do that.
Terem perhaps implies that something is about to happen that we're not quite sure what, but it will happen.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is a really important point. The terem is a very pregnant word, so to speak. It's a word that implies a future. It implies a sense of something will happen, and it's more than something will happen. It implies a certain certainty that something will happen, because terem, not yet, it's not like there isn't this. There isn't yet. The yet is a promise.
Anticipation.
Anticipation. Thank you, Serena. Yes. Barbara?
Potential.
Potential. This is a word with great potential. Anybody else wants to add something?
Yes. We just don't know when it will happen, though. It will happen.
Correct. Shulamit and Kim Isaacs. Thank you. It's, you don't know when, but you know something will happen. One last response from anyone? Okay, so let's keep going. I want to add to all of that the fact that once we hear the word not yet, amongst with all the other thing it implies process. And this is very crucial, because the truth is that in the first creation story, there was no process. There was process in as much as God gradually put parts of creation into place. And presumably, if we could even imagine what it means, if we were there, we would see that things happen in a certain flow, that there's water and then God moves it. But from the storytelling, you can't get that. From the storytelling, it's just all set up. Sorry, I'm just, thank you. Somebody just sent me the link to the source sheets, so I'm going to post it in the chat. Just a second.
I posted it in the chat already, Rachel.
Oh, you did? Okay, great. I
Yes.
thought you posted it to me directly. I think you posted it to me directly.
Oh, I did? Oh, I'm sorry. Then, yeah.
Okay,
post
if
it
you
in the
can
chat
post it
later.
for everybody, I would appreciate it. Thank you, Tvorah.
Okay.
I apologize that it's a little messy today. What can we do? We're trying to figure out a new reality.
Rachel, I can't post it to everybody. You have to do that, or the host.
Okay, I'm going to do that to everyone in meeting. I'm putting it there. I hope it works. It's a folder. It's a Google Drive folder, and you can find the right sheet over there. I hope it helps everybody.
Yeah, it came through.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, what the word terem implies to us in human terms is that there's something that needs to happen before something else, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't just depend on God deciding. Like I decided that now it's a time for light. I decided that now it's a time for sky. I decided that now it's time for plants. It's not that. It's like something from within. Somebody who used the word potential has to give birth to the thing that comes after. And the truth is that the pasuk is very explicit about what it means, what needs to happen. And what needs to happen is two things, two conditions. One is rain, right? Ki lo hemtir Hashem Elokim ala haaretz, meaning there wasn't rain, so there wasn't water to allow the plants to grow. Ve'adam ein la'avod et ha'adama. There is no man to till the earth. So we already know that those two things need to happen. You need to have rain and you need to have humanity. Somehow the rain that God brings and the man that will till the earth and remain, in the sphere of the earth itself will come together to allow plantation, to allow plant life, to allow life to grow out of the land and fill the earth. Now, Rashi, when he looks at this pasuk hey, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the source sheet to box number 3, okay? Rashi actually combines the two. He says it's not about God didn't bring rain, and it's not about the men tilling the earth. Those two things are actually part of the same story, because until there is man, there will not be rain. Why? Because there will not be rain until man prays for it. And he says the following, I'm going to read the English this time. Because God has not caused it to rain. And what is the reason that God has not caused it to rain? Ki adam ein la'avod et ha'adama, because there was no man to till the ground. And there was therefore no one, and listen to this is beautiful, to recognize the utility of rain. When Adam was created, however, and he realized that it was necessary for the world, he prayed for it and it fell, so that trees and verdure sprang forth. In other words, according to Rashi, the way Rashi reads this pasuk, God is not going to gift rain to the world until the need for rain is recognized. This is a sign or something new enters the story here, because suddenly we're not just talking about God creating, we're talking about God seeking partnership, seeking recognition, seeking an encounter and an intimacy that doesn't exist really in the first creation story. In the first creation story, if you recall it, and I think it's fresh in all of our minds right now, so I'll make use of it by not looking at the sources, but rather just speaking about them. In the first creation story, God makes humanity. He makes a male and female humans. He gives them some instructions, but at no point do we hear them responding, saying anything, acknowledging him in any way. And it extends beyond just God. They don't acknowledge each other either. We don't see speech directed from a human either to God or from the man to the woman or the woman to the man. There's no encounter. There's God as the one in absolute power, the obvious protagonist of the story from day one, from day one. And he gives instructions, and the world will run as he wants it to run, and that is that. And the world is perfect, vayachulu hashamayim va'aretz, etc., etc. God is happy, the world is done. In the second story, from the very beginning, before man even exists, just from the way it's described as the terem of it, the not yet of it, and the need for man, and as Rashi needs it, the need for man's recognition and turning to God in speech, we already see that God desires something different. This world, the perfect world of the first creation story, is not the world God wants. What God wants, we're getting a little bit of a hint to God's desire. God's desire is to be in conversation, is to be a partner with us in making the world more than it was. Now, you could say Rashi is reading it midrashically, it's not the pshat, and I would agree with you, but I would say that Rashi is tapping into something that's hinted very powerfully here, which is that man and God are somehow, and I say it with the greatest humility, and I don't mean it literally, but somehow on par. Both are needed to allow growth to happen in the world. So I think even though Rashi is creating a midrashic reading here, is tapping into something that's really ingrained in the language of the pasuk. Now, I want to pause for a second before we develop it further and talk about this man and this partnership and what it means for rain. Historically, I want to open the door. Are there any questions or short comments? Again, please feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. I can't see everybody's raising their hands. Anybody? Okay, so let us continue. And I
I
want
want to
to
make a joke.
yes,
I want
Alan.
to make a joke, but I can't think of any. You're teaching so beautifully.
Thank you, Alan. It's good to see you and hear you. I'm really glad all of you are physically well.
I have 15 hemoglobin.
Oh wow. Okay,
Yeah,
well, be well, Alan.
thank you.
I want to very briefly say that this attribute of the second creation story, the fact that it's kind of starting already from before man is even created, starting from a place of God seeking partnership, God seeking conversation, God expecting from humanity something beyond just mastering the earth as per his instructions, but rather seeing to its needs and turning to him, to capital H, him, with those needs, is a thread that then runs through the entire creation as it's told in the second chapter of Bereshit. And we see it in several ways. Rav Soloveitchik in many of his works goes back to the difference between the first creation story and the second creation story. And Lonely Men of Faith, specifically the part I'm talking about now comes more from his writing about, or really it's his speeches, his shiurim that were turned into a book called Family Redeemed, about family life in Judaism. And when he talks about the second creation story, he points out that man, when he is created, and here it is man, it's not man in the sense of man and woman, it's just man, is constantly brought to experience the limits of his existence or the absences. Just like the beginning of the creation story is about an absence, the absence of man, the absence of rain, and the absence of plants, right? Time and time again, the creation brings man to grappling with the things that he's missing. Because, and let us look at it in the text, I'm going to go back up to box number 2, okay? And read a little bit here together. I'll read it in English now. God, Hashem, formed the human from the soil's humus, blowing into his nostril the breath of life. The human became a living being. Note that the very creation of man here is already almost partnership between what's below and what's above, right? The wind, the air, God's breath, whatever that means, and the earth. Just like man is meant to then bring the needs of the earth to God up high, so that God would bring from the air rain down to create plantation. And then we normally, if you like or I should say like this, in the first creation story, God first created the space and then put men there. But in Pasuk Chet here, we discover that no, in this creation story, first God made man, and then he created a place for him. God had planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the human who had been fashioned. So there must have been, even if it was a moment, there must have been a time when men existed but didn't have where to be. He just had to wait around. Well, God said, oh, wait a minute. Here's your new environment. You go there. So it's not, the first absence is an absence of place. Man is created, but he doesn't have a place. Then we hear that God developed that beautiful garden. I'm not going to read the next few psukim. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. Then we hear how God actually takes man and puts him there in 15. God, Elohim, settled the human in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And God commanded the human, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. So if the first absence that man experienced was the absence of place, now he's experiencing the absence of permission. Or if you want to define it differently, the boundaries of what he's allowed to do. He's put in this beautiful place and he's informed right away that not everything here is open to him. Now, that's the second absence. The third absence, God himself declares. God says in verse 18, "It is not good for the human to be alone. I will make a fitting counterpart for him." So God is informing us. First, there was an absence of place, the absence of permission, and now there's an absence of partnership for man. It's very nice that God and man are in conversation, but man needs someone on par with him. So God says, "I will make him a fitting counterpart." Now, normally we would expect this to be followed by, "and then he made him a fitting counterpart." That certainly would have been what happened in the first chapter. Every time God says, "Let there be this," there was that. Except that's not what happens. Instead, God goes and creates all the animals. And God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky and brought them to the human to see what he would call them. Once again, making man partner him. And whatever the human called each living creature, that would be his name. And God gives names, but at the end of verse 20, we hear, "But no fitting counterpart for a human being was found." It's almost as if God said, I see that man needs a counterpart, but I want to bring man into this realization. So I'm going to show him all the animals, and he's going to have to name all of the animals. And then after he names all the animals, he will also see that none of them matches him. Sorry, Tani, did you want to ask something? I think I saw someone raise their hand. No? Okay. If you do, please feel free. Again, I can't see everybody on the Zoom, so unmute yourself and speak. And I will give more time for questions later also. Anyway, let's go back to the text. Now that man is aware of not having Ezer Kenegdo, then God puts him to sleep and takes one of his ribs. It's almost as if even the woman needs to be created out of absence, something that will be absent out of Adam. He creates her into a woman. It brings her to man, and then the human said in verse 23, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, from man was she taken. Hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh." And what Rabbi Soloveitchik points out is that, in a sense, what God did by creating all these absences, or forcing men to live through all these absences, all these limits on his power and ability to live in the world, is God made him know his own vulnerability, the places where he's not sufficient unto himself. And someone who knows that they're not sufficient unto himself, someone who's aware of the limits and the difficulties, when they come into our relationship, they're open to make room in their lives and their mind and their self for another person in a way that someone who feels whole within themselves and confident that they can do whatever they want and be whatever they want just can't. On a personal note, whenever I think about Etz Hadat and the instruction not to eat from it, I think that God is giving kind of a, hadrachat kala, right? The shiurim that brides are getting before they marry. I feel like God is being a madrich chatanim here, a guide for grooms. Because in a sense, before ever a woman even enters the world and man gets the opportunity to be with her and form a family, form a couple with her, form a covenant with her, God is forcing the man to experience that sometimes there are things in the world that you can enjoy the sight of, you can be present with, but you can't consume. You can't just take what you want from. In our parsha that we're going to be reading this week, we read about what happens to a world where people just take what they want. And the Mefarshim are very clear that a lot of it was taking women. Men took women however they wanted, where they wanted, whenever they could. And already before there's a woman in the world that can be abused or taken against her will, God is kind of forcing man to grapple with the fact that there are some things that are not yours to just take what you want from. On a personal note, Just something it's nice to see when God has wisdom to impart on us in hidden ways in this sense. What does it all mean? All it means is that this, for us, for our discussion, what I'm trying to say is that the creation story that starts with absence, with not yet, with the process to come being promised but not yet executed, is then continues in the same vein, with men being brought to know absence, to know his own vulnerability over and over again. And this is a story that births partnership between God and man, partnership and conversation between God, man and woman in a way that doesn't happen in the first creation story. So we see time and time again that absence or dependence, if you will, because Adam is dependent on God for rain, so he has to pray for it. It's not something he can supply. He needs to depend on God for it. Dependence breeds intimacy and partnership. And the first place where we see it is with the rain, with a lack of rain that requires both man and God to make it happen. Now, if we take this theme of rain as a symbol of our dependence on God, of what we need from God, and the fact that we can't get it on our own and therefore must enter an intimate partnership with God. And we then look at the mentions of rain throughout Tanakh, we will see that this theme keeps being linked with rain over and over and over again. And I will give the most, obvious and famous example, which is the fact that as God explains to us explicitly, or Moshe explains for us for God explicitly in Sefer Dvarim and his warnings before we enter the land, this is a land that depends on rain. The land of Israel depends on rain. And let us see it in the text. Just a moment. Here I am in box number 4. Keep therefore all the instructions that I enjoin upon you today, so that you may have the strength to enter and take the possession of the land that you are about to cross into and possess, and that you may long endure upon the soil that Hashem swore to your fathers to assign to them and to their heirs, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, just to put it in context, Moshe is about to die, and the people are about to enter Israel without him, and he foresees a new challenge. They had many challenges in the desert, but the challenge in Israel is going to be how to not forget God when you're wealthy, when you're fat, when everything is good. How to not forget that you're still dependent, even when it seems like you reached the happy ending of your story. I'm saying these words, and it's very painful for me because to some extent, I think that until Simchat Torah, I thought we reached the happy ending of our story. And it's very painful to realize that we're still fighting and we're still struggling and we're still paying big time. Either way. And as part of his warnings and his reminders and his attempts to convince the people to be careful of this danger, he says the following in Pasuk 10, Pasuk Yud. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors, like a vegetable garden. It's interesting. The English translation here puts emphasis on how hard it was to get water, but the truth is that it's not clear in the Hebrew that that's what it means. The emphasis in the Hebrew is just that V'hishkita beraglecha kegan hayarak, meaning like it was water from below. You had to put your seeds and then the water was from below. You had to put some effort, but it's water from below. The land we're going into is water from above, but the land in 11, but the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of the heavens. It is a land which your God Hashem looks after, on which your God always keeps an eye from year's beginning to year's end. And here God is defining the terms of the partnership he expects from us as the Jewish people. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving your God Hashem and serving God with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will also provide grass in the field for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your field. And he goes on and on and on. And he says, but if you follow other gods and forget God. I'm in 17 now. For God's anger will flare up against you, shutting up the sky so that there will be no rain and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that Hashem is assigning to you. In other words, what in Bereshit Bet begins as the symbol or the axis, the arena of a partnership between humanity in general and God, namely rain, the supply of rain for the world, becomes here the arena for a particular partnership, not humanity's partnership with God, but the partnership of us as the nation we are with God. And yet, even though the scope changed and limited itself, the terms are very similar. The terms still say that rain is not something that happens in a moral vacuum. Rain is something that happens when humanity brings it, when people bring themselves to be in partnership with God. That said, and unlike in Bereshit Aleph, right, in Bereshit Bet, sorry, in the passage we just read about our partnership with God as a people, we already hear that there are different places in the world that don't experience the same level of partnership, right? There is this indication of difference between us and Egypt. There's this indication that some places, in a way that doesn't seem to go along very well with Bereshit Bet, right, don't need to pray for rain, don't need to deserve rain with their moral actions, don't need to yearn for it and enter a place of vulnerability and therefore intimacy with God. And that raises the obvious question, how come that happens? If humanity is created to be in partnership with God, right? If humanity is created in chapter 2 to be in an intimate conversation with God, how come God created this variety of places where this conversation doesn't need to happen at all, where it's not necessary? What does it mean to us theologically that some places foster intimacy while some places do not? It seems unfair, right? To be honest, it seems unfair to me that some people are born in places where they don't need to pray for rain and therefore they don't experience their dependence on God, and then they're blamed for it. But
excuse me, Rachel, can I just?
yes, Rona.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just noticed on the Daf Mekorot on the source sheet for Pasuk Yud Zayin, it says Af Hashem, and Hashem is a hey with a apostrophe on it, but in English it's Shema Shema Mefarash. Could you please not print Shema Shema Mefarash on the source sheets in the future?
Yeah, I'll do my best, but I'll tell you the truth. I'm using the Sefaria app and sometimes they miss something. So I try and go through it. Sometimes I miss it. I'm sorry. It's
I'm
just
not saying I'm not saying I'm throwing it out, but you know, if I don't want to keep it, like at some point it'd have to go to Gnisat rather than.
I understand. I'm doing my best.
Okay, thank you.
I can't promise it's not going to happen again because there's a limit to how much time I can
Okay,
spend going
Fine,
through this.
as long as you're aware of it, just wanted to.
Yeah. No, I do my best. I use the technological tools and everything, but yes, it's a good reminder for all of us to pay attention before we throw out.
Thank you.
So thank you for bringing it to my attention, Rona.
Rachel.
Yes, Shoshana. Yeah.
So you were talking about the disparity between the nations, whether or not it's fair for different places to need rain or not. But having just celebrated Sukkot and thinking about the idea that Sukkot was supposed to be the ingathering of the 70 nations in terms of its symbolism with the 70 korbanot. So eventually we are supposed to get to a point where there's an awareness that the rain everywhere is dependent on God, even though maybe now we're not in that place. Isn't that the ultimate goal?
Correct. There's a certain sense, and like you see it developed a little bit in the Nevi'im.
Rain is dependent, excuse me, rain is dependent upon God, but
Is what? Sorry?
water, she's mixing it up. You didn't say rain wasn't dependent upon God in other places. You were saying the people's dependence upon water because they have water underground.
Yeah, but
they have to
I
ask
think you
God.
understand what Shoshana was saying. Just a second. I think what Shoshana was saying is that our aspiration is to reach a point where it's different, where people everywhere are aware right, Shoshana? Do I understand correctly what you're saying? That is our aspiration. The reality, though, and we experience it in our own history. If you read Sefer Shoftim, it's all about that. The reality, though, is that aspirations are all well and good, but the reality is that we live within certain conditions, and those conditions affect us. And it seems as if God created conditions that affect certain parts of humanity and don't affect others. I'm not going to answer the question about fairness here, because I don't know what, I can't address, just a moment. I see you, Esther, just a moment. I can't address God's fairness. I can't be God's advocate. God is his own advocate. But I will try and unpack it a little bit and try and understand better what changed from the creation story onwards. So I'll get to it in a second. Just one last comment. Esther, yes?
Yeah. To me, Bereshit is the ideal world where God was recognized by all the people. And then you have a series of failures. And the plot, the program changes when Hashem chooses Abraham and the Jews. So the relationship in terms of this particular essence of water has changed from the ideal, which might be what Sukkot is reflecting, that ideal. And now Devarim is a world where it's different, where you have a different relationship between Bnei Israel and Hashem and between the rest of the nations.
This is a very good answer. So thank you. I'll rephrase it a little bit, but I think this is it touches upon one of the core issues or developments of Sefer Bereshit that we're reading now, which is that there's the world that's created, if you want to call it the pre-diluvian world, we're in this, if you'll talk about as if we're in this world as per Parsha, we're in this world now. We're in the Halikan moments of this world between Parshat Bereshit and Noach when it's destroyed. When God created humanity, gave it enormous freedoms, a lot of rope to hang themselves, if I dare say so myself, and expected them to maintain the dignity of Tzelem Elokim within them. It didn't work. And then after the Mabul, God changes tracks. God says, okay, fine. And tries to create a model for the world by choosing one man and then one family and then one nation to model what it is to live up to the dignity of Tzelem Elokim. And that's when the particular covenant that we live comes into play. And when Moshe talks, he talks about this particular covenant, not about the covenant of humanity, because God moved on from that with regret, with like it's not happy. It's not a happy development. It's development by necessity, which is, by the way, a theme that runs throughout Tanakh, that God changes plan A to plan B out of necessity. Think of Chet HaMeraglim, for example, right? Or the first and second Luchot. And there's some deep secret there about our potential versus what it takes to actually reach this potential. We're not going to unpack all of it right now within the 25 minutes we have left. Elaine, you wanted to say something? No, okay, sorry. I want to go back to the text for a little bit, because I think that Esther's answer really captures the essence of what we're seeing here, the move from everybody's a partner with God, everybody prays for rent, to, okay, we're creating a special group that will represent God to everybody else, and therefore hopefully be Ola Goyim and a model for them, and they need to be in a place that dependent on rain so that they can do that, so they can remember that. But I want to unpack it a little deeper by asking ourselves a different question, a more textual question, which is, we saw the role rain had in Gan Eden and the world that was created. What role did rivers, water from below, as God talks, as Moshe talks about it in Dvarim, right? Water is below as the lesser, as the worst option, because it doesn't foster intimacy and encounter and conversation and partnership with God. What role does that play in Gan Eden? And if we go back to the story of the second creation story, we will discover that in fact they play quite an important role. They're not gone. They're not absent. In fact, let us go back into the text, and I'm going back to the second creation story in box 2. We will see that when God, in order to create man, right? Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to go up to box 1. to the very first source. In order to create man altogether, the first thing God did is bring some water from the earth. If you read Pasuk Vav here, the one that comes right after we hear that there was no man and no rain and therefore no plants, we hear ve'ed ya'aleh min ha'aretz, a flow would well up from the ground or steam or something, ve'hishka et kol pnei adama, and watered the whole surface of the earth. Now I'm going to skip the next verse, which is included in the source in box 2. God take this earth and makes from it the shape of man. Now, it doesn't say directly that he took wet earth, but the fact that this is Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et Adam afar min ha'adama follows directly after we heard about that flow, that ed wetting the earth. It's very evocative. We right away can see that God is taking wet earth, like wet clay, and creating a shape from it. So the water that comes from below at this point, it's not bad. It's necessary for the creation of the very man whose job will be to notice the needs of the environment and pray to God and establish a partnership that is symbolized in the prayer for rain and its fulfillment, or in God answering it. You need the water from below for the existence of this man. Now, not only that, but as soon as God creates the environment for the man, before he puts man in it, one of the first things he does after putting all the trees in there is creating rivers. And Pasuk Yud, a river issues from Eden to water the garden, and then divides and becomes 4 branches, but I did breeze. So it's actual rivers. It's rivers we're familiar with are supposed to have come out of the flow, out of the source that was the river that God created to water Eden. In other words, those countries that are based upon rivers, the river economies of Ashur, of Babel, of Nineveh, of Egypt, for that matter, they're not somehow disconnected from God's intentions for the world. God created those rivers. Moreover, he rooted them all in the primordial river that waters the Garden of Eden. And that raises a question, what is God doing here? First, he wants man to come and pray for rain. Then he brings man into a garden where he doesn't need rain. There's rivers. So what was that about? Where did that intention, the original intention that's implied in the beginning of creation before man is created, where does it disappear to once man is actually created? And I think that in this tension that we see between the rain as the desired symbol or arena of partnership and the rivers as a gift God creates unasked for and just gifts to humanity, we see kind of the tension that's almost at the core of who we are as people in a world created by God. Because we are the beneficiaries of this world, regardless of what we do. Those horrible, monstrous humans who came and killed and raped and mutilated a week and a half ago, they enjoy the sun, same as we. They enjoy water, well, some of them now, same as we. They could look around at the beautiful sunlight on the leaves and enjoy it. I don't know if they do. They could enjoy it same as we. The world is there for all of us. But on some level, the fact that it's there, the fact that it's just given to us doesn't change the fact that what God wants from us is not just to enjoy it. God wants us to make a moral choice, to live an uplifted life. It's not enough to be a human being breathing air and drinking water and walking under the sun. That doesn't make us who we should be. It just means that we're enjoying God's kindness without even realizing it. To be who we should be is to choose to be in partnership with God, is to choose intimacy with God. And God is giving Adam everything he needs and expecting him to make this choice anyway. By the way, maybe God learned from that not to do the same when he made a particular covenant with his people. And that is why he gave us a land that depends on rain, because it didn't work out so well with Adam. Adam took all this rope and hanged himself with, so to speak, all this self-pleasure. But by putting both of those forces, the force of rivers and the force of rain in the garden, God makes it clear for all of humanity, because the story of Adam is more than a historical analysis. It's a model, it's an archetype for all of us to learn from. God is basically kind of drawing the map for us. He's saying, you will have all these things. Water can be plentiful. Grass can be plentiful. The sun is there. Everything is there. But that's just the beginning. That's the beginning of the story. The end of the story has to come from your striving to be more, to be dependent on me, to be aware of your dependence on me, to be in conversation with me. Now, if we talked a little bit about rain in Tanakh, and we'll talk more about it in coming weeks. And
Excuse
how rain,
me.
just a moment
May
now.
I say something?
I'll give
Okay.
you. Yes.
No, it's okay.
I'll get back to you in a second. I just want to finish this thought. The rain stories in Tanakh, time and time again, center or bring forth the theme of dependence and partnership and intimacy between us and God. By the same token, or conversely, the river stories in Tanakh often bring forth kind of a negative example of what happens to people who lose their sense of dependence on God. And Ellen, I remember I'll get back to you in a minute, but I want to just look at one source that really, I think, puts it together very well. I'm going to skip ahead to box number 6, all the way down on page 5, to the moment when Avraham and Lot part ways in a few parashas. Avram and Lot go together to Israel, and then go together to Egypt, and go together through the horrific experience of Sarah being kidnapped. I mentioned people just taking women if they want. Sarah being taken to the castle. And then without God's interference, she would have just stayed there, and that would have been that. Instead, God interfered, and Avraham and Lot both come up from Egypt very, very rich. So they might think, like a lot of times when we go through an experience, we think we all went through the same experience, but then what happens afterwards reveals that it was different, that different people experience different things. And what happens in the scene we're going to read now, the famous scene of their parting of the ways, makes it clear that while Avram experienced what happened to him in Egypt as a horrific thing and God's miraculous intervention, what Lot experienced was, oh my goodness, we went to this rich and beautiful land and we came back so rich. That's the life. That's what I want. And we see it because when there's a merivah, when they're both heavy in possessions, they have great herds, and there's not enough grass where they're at for all those herds. And according to the Midrash, Lot even let his herdsmen take his herds to other people's land and eat their grass. And Avram's people were not okay with that. One way or another, Avram says, let's not fight. And he says in Pasuk Tet, Halo kol haaretz lefanecha. The whole land is before us. There's a lot of empty space. Hipared na me'alai. Separate yourself from me. Im hasmol ve'im yamim. If you go left, I'll go right. Ve'im yamin ve'asmila. If you go right, I go left. Avram is making it very clear that this is not a banishment. He's not sending Lot away. He's just saying, let's separate as friends. And then Lot, Vaisa Lot et enav. And I should point out that in Tanakh, when someone Vaisa et enav, raised their hands, it usually doesn't mean just physically looked. It's usually followed by something that tells us what their soul seeks. Like it's like a sight that goes beyond the moment. There's something deep in what they see. So what does Lot see? Vayar et kol kikar Yarden, the whole plain of the Jordan, ki kula mashke. All of it, this was water, like drink. Lifnei shachet Hashem et Sdom ve'et Amorah. Like that, before God destroyed Sodom and Amorah. This is kind of a editorial interjection to tell us, I know. When you look at the Jordan Valley now, it looks different, but it's because there was something that has yet to happen. And now, what is it likened to? And again, we're in Lot's point of view. This is what he sees. When he sees the Jordan Valley, that it's all saturated with river water, Kegan Hashem, the garden of God. And that is Eden. The garden of God is Eden. He sees the connection, the correct connection, the true connection between this water and the water of Eden. And the other thing he compares it to is Ke'eretz Mitzrayim Bo'achatzo, just like the land of Egypt. So when Lot decides where to go to live, he is in a sense orienting himself through following the hints of two dreams. One is the dream of Eden, the dream of a world where you can just lean back and eat and drink, and God takes care of you, and you don't need to do anything at all. And the other is the dream of Egypt. And that is a far more disturbing dream in a sense in this context, because he was just in Egypt, and Egypt is a place where they take women without consent, but he doesn't care. We will later hear explicitly in the Pasuk, I'm not going to read it right now, but the Pasuk later says that Anshe Sdom Ha'im V'Chata'im Me'od. It was a known thing. He went to Sdom knowing, and he must have known that as soon as he settled there also, even if he deluded himself before that these are evil people. But he went there anyway because of the plenty, because of the ease that the plenty promises. And we see this twist, this connection between rivers and corruption, moral corruption, come over and over and over again. And Rabbanit Yael Ziegler talked about it last year in the podcast about these Parshat and Bereshit in the Matan podcast. And she pointed out that in Sefer Bereshit, time and time again, the righteous live through famines and barrenness, while places that have plenty of births and plenty of water, namely Egypt mostly, but also Sodom, breed a certain corruption in human relationships. And here we're touching another very deep secret. I mentioned before that in Bereshit Bet, it's not only God man enters a partnership with, it's also Eve, the woman. He talks with her. He has a relationship with her that doesn't happen at all in the first creation story. In other words, when we are aware of our own dependence and incompletion and the absences in our lives and our loneliness and all those things that make us not sufficient unto ourselves, it opens us up to a partnership with God just as it opens us to a partnership with other people. But the opposite is true also. When everything is plentiful and we just lean back and enjoy it and allow ourselves to just be there in that pleasure, it closes our heart to God because we don't realize how dependent. We forget the gratitude and the dependence we owe God, and it closes our hearts to each other. And I want to show how it kind of runs as a theme throughout, but I first want to pause for a second. Alan, you wanted to ask or say something?
I did. You know, what Yaakov says to Rachel always bothers everybody, every woman. You know, don't ask me, ask God. But my advice for anyone who's listening to a secret advice from Gaza, why ask us, ask God? Like they want water. They want water. Why don't they ask God? That's where it comes from.
Yeah. In the
I interrupt
Midrash,
class with this. I don't know. I had to say it.
in the Midrash, water and life, like life in the sense of birth, are very connected because we say that there's three keys. There's famous Midrash, right? That there are three keys that are in the hand of God. And they're the keys of rain and the keys of birth and the keys of Tchiyat HaMetim. And interestingly, and we'll talk more about that in 3 weeks, there are moments when God gives those keys to people, but never two at once. So I think that the comparison you're making between asking for children and asking for water is a very profound one. So thank you, Alan. Rivka, did you want to say something? I thought I saw you raising your hand, or somebody else? Okay. Anybody wants to ask something or comment on the text we're reading? Okay, I'll try and leave more time at the end. I can't promise because I just noticed that we're less than 10 minutes to go. So we have to wrap it up. But I want to talk a little bit about rivers through our history, and then I want to close it all with something that's relevant for us right now, for us both in the reality we're in and just in terms of the time of the Jewish year we're in. The idea that river culture are rotten morally, by the way, is not just a Jewish idea. It's something that various thinkers and historians talk about how, I'll bring an example in Against the Grain. Scott, I forgot his full name, I'm sorry, you have him in the source sheet if you're interested, talks of Scott James, I think. Sorry, can't think about it right now. Talks about how people lived in all kinds of environment, but the kind of civilizations that were a small caste of people enslaved the many only developed around rivers in the ancient world, because in order to build this kind of civilization, you need to build wealth. And in order to build wealth, you need to have something you can accumulate. And people who lived as hunters-gatherers didn't have much to accumulate. People who lived off seafood didn't have much to accumulate. Grain is what you can accumulate. And grain can be grown only on the riverbeds, at least in the ancient world. People had wild grains that they would have to go and follow, but you can't accumulate that. You go and find a little bit here, a little bit there. At the riverbeds, you could grow grain and accumulate it and tax it and build a whole hierarchy around it of, the king and his tax collectors and his soldiers. And what Scott points out is that it comes with the false promise of security. What the king does is he builds a group of warriors and he says, you give me some of your grain and I will protect you from barbarians, roaming herds of people, whatever, disasters. I will protect you. And at some point it starts warping people's sense of self. And Yoram Chazoni writes about it a lot in the philosophy of Hebrew scripture, if you're interested. Again, I brought some quotes, but we don't have time to read them directly. How it warps people's sense of morality because they start believing the lie. And they start saying, oh yeah, the king defends us. Everything we have comes from the state, the king, Paro, if you will. And therefore we should do what Paro says. And if we don't, he will kill us. So it's even more inducement to just stay in the straight and narrow of doing what the tyrant wants from you. And it's very hard within that system to remember that there is a God and you should call to God and you should do what God wants from you. And that's why it's so remarkable, for example, that the Me'aldot in the beginning of Exodus, out of fear of God, overcome their fear of Paro and do the right thing and don't kill the Jewish babies. It's a remarkable moment of breaking through a whole system, a whole economy, a whole society dedicated to maintaining this lie of the right and wrong are defined by the person above me. All of that can't grow in places where there's nothing to accumulate. And that's why the rivers, and this is not biblical discussion, this is just historical discussion, breed a certain type of social interactions that are hierarchical instead of partnership-based. And we see it come again and again. We see it in the dreams of Paro. When Paro dreams his dreams, Rav Soloveitchik has a beautiful perush on Paro's dreams where he says that what Paro is really seeing is that the river, which is the source of his civilization, can be the source of good, of plenty, the fat cows, but it can also be the source of evil, the bad cows. Paro latches onto Yosef's interpretation that makes it all about, how to save my civilization. He misses the point about the morals of it. But according to Rav Soloveitchik, Yosef doesn't, because what Yosef says is the only way for civilization to be redeemed, to be God-oriented, to be right and not wrong, is partnership, is when we help each other, when we collect grain and then give it out, not for the benefit of the ruler only, but for the benefit of the humanity. Unfortunately, we know that the way it was implemented was not perfect. It made everybody slaves to Egypt, to Paro, and prepared the way for our enslavement to Paro. And we don't have time to go into it, but time and time again, you see the same thing. You see that rivers and Tanakh come with this, sometimes with people withstanding corruption, but it always comes with a challenge of how not to be corrupted. In other words, it comes exactly with a challenge that Moshe warns the people about on the eve of his death, when he says, when you go in and you're fat and you're wealthy, you need not to lose your way. And God built in an insurance by making it dependent on rain to remind you of it, but you're still going to need to heed this insurance. Now, so what does it all mean? Okay, so we established that rain is a symbol and a motor or motivation for partnership and intimacy with God and other people. We established that river and plenty and water that comes from below, it's God's gift to us. It's beautiful, but it's also an arena where we often lose our way, morally speaking, and in terms of our relationship both with God and with other people, because we establish our relationship with them on power dynamics instead of on partnership. But where does it leave us? This is all very nice for, I hope that when you read Tanakh next, you will notice how it appears everywhere throughout Tanakh, and that's great. But what does it mean for us right now? So I want to finish with one idea that's tied very deeply to where we're at the year right now. Sorry, it's the second I come back to the here and now, the horror of what we're living through is overwhelming. It's just hard to fathom. I'll start with something from Torah, and then I'll finish with a thought really about mamash, what we're living through right now. We are right now, in terms of the Jewish calendar, in this weird time when we kind of pray for rain, but also kind of don't. We started saying Mashiva Ruach on Simchat Torah, on the very day when our brothers were dying, brothers and sisters. But we're not fully transforming our davening. We're still in the fifth bracha of Shemona Esrei. We didn't shift to praying for rain. And the reason we don't do it, and this is already from the time of the Amoraim, like we're discussing about it, and the Tanaim, we're talking about it, is because we care for those Jews who came on pilgrimage for Sukkot and have to make it all the way to the Euphrates River, all the way to the Bavel. And they calculated a certain amount of time, 15 days, that it would take for them. And therefore, in Zayin Cheshvan, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Motzei Shabbat and Sunday this year, if I'm not mistaken, please don't take me up on that. That's when we really start praying. Because understanding is that if somebody dilly-dallies on the way and is still delayed after that, like, okay, we can't withhold water from all of Eretz Israel, all of humanity because of that. But we can make that concession. We cannot fully ask for it for 2 weeks, even though it is the natural time for rain. Like, it would make sense to ask for rain. It's already rained several times here in Jerusalem, as the snails in my parking lot can tell you with great excitement. Because we care. Because rain at its core is about partnership with God and with the people around it. It's like expanding circles of partnership. If we understand that rain is partnership with God, then it will help us expand our heart to the next circle of partnership with other people. And I think that as we dwell in this place and these 2 weeks of heightened awareness to the needs of other people, we can see it in play around us right now. We can see how, since the horrific attack on Simchat Torah, everybody is doing their best to help each other, to support each other. People are baking cookies, collecting money, babysitting for children whose parents were called to reserve duty, sending clothes, folding clothes, cleaning clothes for soldiers. A friend of mine lives up north where there's soldiers are gathering. Like, there's like an ongoing rotation. Soldiers coming in, taking showers in people's houses, people making sandwiches for them, people taking care of all their needs. We're all trying as hard as we can to be partners with one another. And my prayer, and with that, we're going to finish. My prayer is that we take this awareness with us from the times of obvious dependence and obvious absence and obvious difficulty to the times of plentifulness and wealth and success. That when, God willing, we finish and we win and we go back to a time of prosperity, we remember all of this. We remember all of this togetherness. We remember all of this partnership and carry it with us into the future, into the, God willing, many, many years of happiness still to come. And on that note, thank you all for being with me here today. Like I said, this is
Amen.
comfort.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Such a
Within it.
beautiful shiur. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you very
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that when we meet next, we will have victory stories to share. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Amen.